Welcome to this training video on model orientation and basically how to set up Tekla structures to display the assembly direction for your erection drawings as well as your assembly drawings. Now, here we see an ideal erection plan. We have everything from the piece marks as well as the orientation marks are completely matching together. And we can see the beam marks are towards the left end tied with the orientation marks, which are the circles there, as well as towards the bottom. The columns are clearly marked with the directional face, which is exactly the face that the fabrication shop is going to mark and actually scribe on there or draw on the column the orientation, so that way the field knows exactly how to orient and erect the assemblies out in the field. Now, this is super critical in the sense that if we didn't give these instructions to the fabrication shop and in the field, basically they have to shake down the steel, look at the assembly drawings, try to look at the column, and then figure that out. And they're spending a lot of time trying to plan how the pieces need to be erected. And if they put the steel up the wrong direction and the crane moves on, well, the crane's got to come back, take that column up, and then rotate it around and put it in the right direction, or same thing with the beam. So it's super critical to spend the time doing this correctly in detailing versus having downtime, which is expensive out in the field. All right, so let's first start with our Project North. If you go into your Tekla Structures model underneath Settings Options and then Orientation Marks, you'll be able to set the Project North direction. Now, if you have it at 0 degrees, that's going to be basically aligned with the global positive X. Now, I have set it to be the positive Y, so that way it's going up in our plan view here. And so I set the rotation to 90 degrees. So the angle going from 0 goes in counterclockwise direction. So if I set 90, it's going to be positive Y. If I set 180, it's going to be negative X, and so on. All right, so from here, I then in the same options decided to set the mark location, the preferred location for piece marks. So on beams, I want my piece marks to typically be towards the left end of the member. And then north and south beams, or up and down in plan view here, we want them to be towards the bottom. So this is the next setting that we've set up, and typically we want this defaulted to left. Now, what this means is that if we're doing our beam and column drawings, then essentially we want the front web or the front view of those assembly drawings to be lined up basically here on the south side of the building, or the south side of the beam. So that way the left end or the piece mark is towards the left. So then if we look at beams that are going north and south, we want to be looking towards the west, and we're looking at the east face of the column or the east face of the beam web. Okay, so just think about that. Look at the piece marks there. They're towards the bottom and towards the left. And so when we make an assembly drawing, we want to see the piece mark to be towards the left. So here, as an example, if we make the shop drawing or the assembly drawing, we see that the orientation is towards the left, and we're looking at the front face of the web there on the south or the east. And we want this to be the same whether the detailer makes the drawing with the local, oriented, or model coordinate systems. And same thing on a column over here to the right. Notice here that I've got my C1 column. I want the mark face to always be towards the left or the top, depending on how you've oriented the column, whether it's in model or local or oriented coordinate system views. And we want the orientation mark to be towards the top left. So in order to do this, to make it so that way no matter how we set the coordinate system, we always get the shop drawing to look the same, what we're going to do is we're going to set the settings here on our viewing direction and the way that we model in Tekla structures to make sure that they match. Now let's say that we wanted to use the oriented or model coordinate systems on our assembly drawings. If we want to do that and we want to be able to look at the south or the east face of our column and beam assembly drawings, then basically we need to set the options to beams and bracings in assembly drawings as south or east that we see here on the left-hand side. Then for columns, we want that to match the same logic as what we've set here for beams. So again, we want to look at the south as well as the east face for our assembly drawings if we're using oriented or model. Now, instead of oriented or model, let's say that we wanted to use the local coordinate system of our assembly drawings. Now, this is where modeling the rotation on columns and the direction in which you model beams has a pretty significant effect here. So I'm going to want to model my beams from the yellow start point to left, or west to east, or left to right. So the magenta point is my second point picked. And when I do that, the local assembly coordinate system, the front web is going to be towards the south. And then over here on this vertically drawn beam, I'm going to start from modeling the first pick point from south, and the second pick point to the north. And when I do that, the local coordinate system of that beam is going to be so that way the front web is towards the east, exactly like the oriented. So here's what I'm doing is by modeling in the beams a certain direction, as well as setting the viewing direction in the project or the settings and options. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying that no matter what the detailer does, I'm making sure that the shop drawings are going to end up drawing the same way. And so that way there's no room for error. Basically, I've found all the different ways that Tekla is going to be able to draw this, and I'm setting them the same so that way everything is consistent no matter what. Now, like on columns, what we're going to do is for this column C1 here, where we've got the web parallel to the north and the south, I'm going to set the rotation to back. And then where we have the web parallel to east and west for this C2 column, I'm going to set the rotation to top. Now, I'm not going to cover this completely in this video, but you got to be careful because beam and column position properties change if you change the work plane in the model. So I'm assuming right now with these rotations that the global work plane is positive X here to, along grid line A, and then on this vertical north-south grid line, that's positive Y. But if you changed the work plane, then these rotations change. So also making sure that the work plane is set the way that you want when you're inputting your beams and your columns, and setting these rotations is pretty important as well. Now next up is actually our numbering settings. You'll see here that I've got C1 and C2 highlighted, and the C1 is the exact same size, and I don't have any connections or anything in the model yet. And the C1 is the same, almost identical to the C2. In fact, you could almost say that they should combine piece marks because I haven't applied any connections yet. But in the numbering settings, because I set the column orientation here, basically what it's showing me is that any columns that are greater than 45-degree difference from each other is going to get different piece marks. And I'm intentionally wanting to do that because I'm putting the face direction in the piece mark on both the shop drawing as well as on the erection drawing. Again, what face direction basically means is I'm showing what is the top flange of that column aligned with. Is it aligned with the south, west, north, or east? And so if I have a column that's actually, where the web is aligned north and south, I'm going to get a different face direction than one that is aligned east and west. And so I want them to get different piece marks so that way I can depend on that face direction call out. So that's why I have the column orientation set here. Now, beam orientation, you may decide you want to use that or not, but again, it follows the same rules that where if I've got these beams here that are just going east and west versus north and south greater than a certain angle of rotation, then essentially what I'm saying is that I'm telling Tekla, don't combine the piece marks for these. I want you to consider the orientation to make these different. Now, some people have this on and some people have this off. If you have it unselected, then basically beams that are flat here in the east and west and north and south, if they're identical, would be able to combine piece marks. So that's up to you if you want to use that or not. You just have to be careful when you have this unchecked that are the basically the orientation marks, if you choose to use that, going to match. Because if you have a beam that's going from right to left and you combine piece marks with something over here that's left to right, the orientation mark is not going to necessarily match between those two beams. So in this case, if I'm going to use orientation marks just to be safe, I've set beam orientation to be on. So speaking of orientation marks, one important thing to understand is the setting that controls which side of columns and beams that orientation marks are placed is in the advanced options. It's XS orientation mark direction, and I've currently got it set to south and west. Now, one thing that's also important to understand here is that the north direction for orientation marks is hard-coded in Tekla structures to be the positive Y in the global coordinate system. And this trips people up because that hard-coded positive Y as the north for this is different and doesn't necessarily correlate to the project north that we set over here on the left. And so that's something you'll just have to be aware of. And if you change this north, the project north, you'll have to just sort of do the mental work of figuring out how you want to set the advanced option so orientation marks line up with the beams the way that you want. All right, so with that being said, then if we come in here and look at the south, so like here I've got the settings set to south and west. So when I look at beams that are going in the north-south direction, or columns that are parallel with the north-south direction, basically what I'm talking about is the orientation mark is going to be placed towards the south end of the beam, or the flange that is facing the south side of the building, and that's where the orientation mark will be placed. If we look at the west, we're going to be placing the orientation mark on the left, or the west end of the beam, and the flange of the column that is most aligned or closest to the west side of the building. So that's where the orientation marks will be placed, and how that works in correlation to the hard-coded positive Y as being seen as the north. Now, the last thing I'm doing here to help the field out is I'm setting this mark always to center of column in GA drawing to no. And the reason why I want to do that is because I want the piece mark on columns on the erection drawings to actually point to the flange that is the mark face. So I've put the face direction in the part mark so you can see south and west, but I'm also going the extra mile and pointing specifically to that flange. That way the field is clued in that the face and the mark that they see on the assembly when they unload it off the truck is going to match and correlate here on the erection drawing. Let's take a look at a couple of additional settings. The first big one is this excess excluded parts in orientational numbering. This is really great. Since we showed before that we wanted to have beam and column orientation checked in our numbering settings, well, there are certain pieces in the model that we don't want to be considered, like anchor rods. If I have an anchor rod with a hook on the bottom, if it's rotated 0 versus 90 degrees, I don't want it to get different piece marks. I want those piece marks to combine if the geometry of the assembly or the part is the same. Same thing with other connection materials or loose plates and angles and things like that. I want those to combine. So this is a way that you can actually set those part names so that way they are filtered out from the orientation numbering. Now, the next thing is that if you are going to set the no for drawing the column piece marks at the center of the column, and you want to point specifically to the face of the column that the mark is set at, then basically one thing I also suggest is using this do not draw column marks at 45 degrees. So this is allowing you to, if you set it to true, it basically is going to turn it into a horizontal mark, a lot like the beam marks and other things. So that way you can more cleanly set up the organization of the drawing. So let's quickly do a recap. The biggest thing to take away is that you want everything to match. All of the different settings that control orientation and piece marking and the way that you model, you want it to match. So let's start by defining our project north, then deciding what preferred end do we want the marks to be located at, and then let's model in the steel and set our viewing direction on assemblies so that way everything matches that. So here, south and to east in this particular case. And no matter whether we're working in the local, oriented, or model coordinate system for our beam or our column assembly drawings, we're going to set the viewing direction as well as model in the steel and set its rotation in a way that will make sure that the drawings always match. Next, we're going to set our numbering settings, and if we're going to use the face direction, for instance, on columns, and we want beams to be different between 90 and 0 degree rotation, then we're going to check the beam orientation and column orientation in our numbering settings. And again, if you're using orientation marks and you're going to correspond that with your orientation numbering settings, make sure that you understand that the orientation mark north is hard-coded to the positive Y, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to the project north, so you'll have to just figure that out. And the direction that's set here on the advanced options is always the end of the beam or the face of the column flange that's closest to the faces defined in that advanced option. So again, here the left or west end of the beam and west column flange, or south column flange and south or bottom end of the beam. Lastly, again here, we're going ahead and setting that the column piece marks are pointing to the face, the top face of the flange of the column, so that way we can easily see where the mark is and see that mark face shown on the assembly and on the erection drawings.